I remember the Terry Scheibel case. 1990, she had a heart attack. And then for 15 years, she stayed in a vegetative state. Well, at 15 years after being in a vegetative state, the husband decided he was going to pull the plug on her. I mean,
Was this like the reason why they said, is she alive, or is she considered alive, or is she considered dead?
oh yeah. Everybody got involved. I mean, everybody got involved. It was really kind of fascinating to watch what was going on with the Terry Scheibel case. Where was I at the time? She had her heart attack in 1990. In 1990, I was in Oklahoma. All this stuff hit the fan in 2004, 2005, and I was up in Oklahoma, or Montana at the time. But all of this stuff was very controversial because the husband decided that he was going to pull the plug after 15 years of her being in a nursing home in a vegetative state. The parents tried to gain custody of her so that they could keep her alive, and because they said that they saw her reacting to things, that she'd come in and her mother would come in and Terry would start smiling, and they said that was proof to them that there was still some lucidity in there. But the doctors were looking at her brain scans, and they weren't seeing any activity at all. The only activity they were seeing was kind of like a thunderstorm. You've got a nice sunny day all the way from Monday through Friday, and then on Saturday a thunderstorm hits, and you get 15 or 20 lightning strikes, and then it's sunny again. And that's what she would have. She would be flatlined, and then every once in a while she'd have these electrical discharges in her brain. And her mother thought that those electrical discharges were proof that there was still some life in her brain. And her husband got tired of taking care of wasn't really taking care of her, but I mean he was in charge of her care, and he did this for 15 years. He was 31 when she was born. I mean when she had her heart attack. So by this time he's 46 years old. 46 years old, and he decides it's time to move on. So he decides he's going to pull the plug on her. But the parents take him to court, and they try to become the executors of her life. And of course, every state in the union has the same laws. If an individual is married, then it's their spouse that has can make life and death decisions about them. You don't pass it on. It doesn't work that way. But in 2004, of course, when he decided to pull the plug, the parents took it to the Florida Supreme Court, and the Florida Supreme Court upheld, or they had a stay of execution, I guess you could say, but they wouldn't allow him to pull the plug. And he decided that he was going to, they decided that he could pull the plug. It was the governor of the state. The governor of the state at the time was Jeb Bush, the brother of the president of the United States, who was George W. Bush. Okay. So the Florida Supreme Court decided that all the precedent that they could find said that a husband had a right to make life and death decisions for his wife. And the Schindlers went to Bush, and Bush decided that he was going to overturn the Supreme Court, but of course you can't overturn the Supreme Court in the state. So he went to Congress. He went to the federal Congress, and he requested, actually he went to his brother, and he requested that he sign an executive order that they couldn't pull the plug on Terry Scheibel. And he did. He wrote a decision, or he made it he wrote made an executive decision that they couldn't do that. And then and of course, this is changing all the laws that exist. So the Congress got involved, and Congress decided that they would do the same thing. It was a Republican Congress, and it was a Republican president, and they decided exactly the same thing. So Shiloh took it to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court didn't make a decision on it, which means that it goes back to the lower courts, whatever decision the lower courts make. So here we have the President of the United States, we have the United States Congress, we have the governor of the state, and we have the Florida Supreme Court, and we have the Supreme Court of the United States, all making decisions on whether they're going to pull the plug on this individual or not. And eventually they decided for the husband, and they did pull the plug, and she did die in 2005. Okay, that was the case. Now you can imagine with this thing bouncing all over the United States, going from Florida to the president, to the Oval Office, from the Oval Office to Congress, from Congress to the Supreme Court. You can imagine that this was on everybody's mind, and everybody was talking about it. It was in national newspaper. It was in newspapers all over the United States. Okay, so that's the Terry Shiloh case. Why is this important? It's important because people who were conservative in the United States were trying to change the laws. What law would be next if they were able to overturn this whole idea? What law were they really trying to do away with in 2005, in 2004, 2005? What law do you think that they were really talking about? If it didn't have anything to do with spouses, I mean, what were they really trying to do? They were trying to overturn the law of the land. So what other law of the land would conservatives like to overturn?
Roe versus Wade?
Roe versus Wade. Yeah. If the president could overturn a precedent like this, if the president could make an executive decision that this was overturned, then the next thing that would happen would be he'd overturn Roe versus Wade. He was elected in 2004 on a platform that he was going to do away with Roe v. Wade. It didn't happen, of course, but he did get elected, and whatever happened next. Of course, we're still fighting about it. We're still fighting about putting people on the Supreme Court.
So what would happen if he does overturn, or what would be up to the Supreme Court to overturn that, right? So what happens, and then after another couple of years, they can reinstate the law? Can that happen?
Reinstate the law? Sure, yeah, they can change the law. The Supreme Court can read the law any way that the Supreme Court wants to. But normally what happens, if the Supreme Court sees it one way, then that becomes precedent. And that's one of the reasons why Roe v. Wade is still on the books, is because back in 1972, 1973, when the Supreme Court made the decision, it has become the law of the land. The other thing is, another interesting precedent that the Supreme Court has set. For the longest, states were writing laws that marriages could only be between a man and a woman. There were state of Utah passed a law that said that only men and women could be married in the state of Utah, would be recognized in the state of Utah. And then the federal government decided that they were going to recognize marriages between the same-sex marriages. And because the federal government made that decision, it overturned all the states that said something different.
So it supersedes the state
yeah,
law?
Exactly. Federal
Now,
laws.
and then the Supreme Court supersedes the federal laws, right? Or is that federal law and Supreme the
The
same?
Supreme Court interprets federal law. Okay. And they can overturn something. Slavery was the law of the land until 1865, or actually 1863. until Abraham Lincoln wrote the Emancipation Proclamation. You can change law. It does change, and that's what we're looking for with every Supreme Court decision. We're trying to see if they're changing law. And right now, of course, before we had a more liberal court, now we have a more conservative court. So we're waiting to see how this court interprets things. We have a Supreme Court justice that's 86 years old, and she has just fought off pancreatic cancer for the second time. Maybe. That's what she said anyway. And she's probably waiting to retire, but she's a liberal, she's a liberal judge, and she doesn't want to retire until she is replaced by another liberal judge. So it gets really interesting. We're talking about people, dying in the court. It's really kind of fascinating. Anyway, so I thought I would find an article dealing with Terry Schiavo. So the first thing that you have to do when you're looking for an article critique is find a research article. There's lots of articles out there that are just information articles. And so the first article I found was not the one that you're holding, but another one. Wait a second. And there it is. Yeah, there it is right there. A Death in the Family, Reflections on the Terry Schiavo Case. It's only a 2-page article, but it's not a research article. It's just an information article. They're just talking about the Terry Schiavo case. Now, it's easy to find articles that are just informational. This one is just what the guy, how he felt about the Terry Schiavo case, and how it changed the way we look at federal courts and state courts and state Supreme Courts and whatnot. Anyway, I found this one first. And of course I couldn't use it because it's not a research article. I can't answer all the questions. Okay. So the article I found was the one that you're holding on to. Inclusive Discourse, Local Media's Coverage of the Terry Schiavo Case. And of course it's authored by 3 different individuals, Rollinger, Peterson, and Valley. And they actually did research on newspaper articles dealing with the Schiavo case. Really kind of a fascinating article. They were looking at the news media and what kind of articles that they have. So one of the first things that you need to do when you, oh, here it is right here, or not, wait a minute. One of the first things that you do, yeah, Death in the Family, that's the other one that I was looking at. So one of the first things that you need to do is you need to look at the journal, you need to look at the title, and you need all this information. The DOI is not necessary. You don't have to have the DOI, but you have to have the authors. You have to have the title. You need the journal title as well. This is the volume number, and this is the issue number. And it was issue number 1, and this was the first article in the magazine. So it was 1 through 25. That's all information that you need. And when you write it in an APA format, that's the way it looks. Okay.
Basically, we don't need a DOI. Right?
You don't have to have a DOI.
Do you have to put the URL at the end or no?
URL. No. No. That's okay. The APA comes out with rules as to how you do this from time to time. And every once in a while they'll change. I was working on my dissertation in 2010. They came out with the 6th edition. And of course I wrote my dissertation using the 5th edition. And there was a difference. And I had to change my whole dissertation.
What's the difference?
Between the 5th and the 6th? Well, for one thing, you don't have the hanging
invention.
Hanging indent. Yeah.
Really? So why do they do that? I mean, what's the meaning behind that?
There is no rationale behind it. It's just some crazy psychologist decided that they would do it. It used to be single space, now it's double space.
So citations are double space?
They're double space, right? Yeah.
Really?
Yeah. And it's double spaced between each, if you have two citations. it's the same, so the only way that you can tell it's a different citation is because it has a hanging indentation.
Okay.
Okay. As much fun as that is, okay.
So if I'm citing a reference, it has to be double spaced.
Yeah. Should be double spaced. So we need all the authors. If they have, and of course you use initials, you don't use first names. You don't use whatever, if they're PhD or an MD, it doesn't really matter. You don't put that in there. All you do is put in their initials.
So I have a question, if you have like 3 authors, you would write it out, 2 names and then
And the ampersand, right. The ampersand. And there's a space between this period and this letter. Okay, I know, it seems so stupid, but you will have individuals who look for that space, and if that space isn't there, they get upset. And I do too, of course, because I teach this stuff. Okay, so you've got all your authors, you've got the ampersand. You have to have an ampersand. If you put and in there, A and D, that's incorrect. It has to be an ampersand.
Question,
What if, like, we use like Purdue Owl or,
We'll give you all this same information. Should be exactly the same.
so it's comma and ampersand, right?
Yeah, and yeah, it has to be the ampersand.
if you go on Google Scholar, it shows you, it gives you the whole AP citation.
Good for them, but sometimes they get it wrong.
Are you serious?
I am
Okay,
serious.
look, is this right then?
Well, let me put my glasses on.
Look, this one right here.
No, that's wrong.
No.
It is wrong. Well, it's got the, look.
Why?
Well,
Look, the AP from right here, the second line.
the second one. Okay,
Yeah.
yeah. See, that's right, and yeah, that's wrong. Yeah, that's correct.
That's correct?
That's correct.
Okay,
Okay.
that's fine.
The other thing is that you need to make sure that the title of the journal is italicized.
what if there's
Really?
volumes and sections?
Volume is,
Oh, okay.
yeah, the volume is italicized too. However,
Volume?
there's no space between the issue and the volume. Okay, there's no space, and this one isn't italicized. Okay? How important is this? Well, this is just the way they do it, so this is the way we do it. Okay. One of the interesting things is, if you go to graduate school, and I'm assuming everybody's going to go to graduate school, when you go to graduate school, if you don't do it this way, they're going to know that you weren't taught correctly. Okay. That's why I'm so serious about this. Because I want you guys to go to graduate school, and I don't want them to give you a B when you should have had an A just because you forgot a comma in your reference, your citation. Okay, the title of the article does not have any capital letters unless it's a proper word, a proper noun.
Like Navajo?
Navajo is a proper noun. You capitalize a word after punctuation, not a comma, but if it's a colon, then you capitalize it. Here's a question mark, and the next word, of course, is capitalized. Isn't this fun? Of course, Teresiago is a name. These are proper nouns, so they are capitalized. It's a period after the title of the article, and then of course you have the title of the journal. And the journal is, all the letters are capitalized. Okay, so what if there's an ampersand in the title of the journal? If they have an ampersand in it, you never put an ampersand in the title
So it's
of the journal. So you have to spell out and.
It's the title.
It's the title, right, but it means and so you put in A and B, not ampersand. Isn't that strange? You have to have an ampersand here, but you can't have an ampersand here. Okay.
Why?
Just like
Where's
it's
all
for the
this
rules.
list of rules? Where can we find this information?
Purdue Owl, I have a book in my office. It's about 300 pages, and it's all about how to write this. Isn't that strange?
So I'm doing mine in Word document, and I'm
Okay.
using the 6th edition, and I insert the worksite reference, and it only references the last author. So what am I doing wrong here?
No, they're not, you're not doing anything wrong. They're doing something.
So it's best to type it in rather than using the soft.
Well, if you use the software, sometimes the software is incorrect. APA, if you're looking at an APA journal, sometimes they do it wrong.
So who's right?
The book is right.
The book, not the website,
The
or,
website is sometimes incorrect.
see, this is what I have.
But if you know all of this, then you can edit what they do. This is it. You always put a space in between each of the initials. You use ampersands.
Ampersand?
Ampersand, this is an ampersand. I know, it's a stupid name.
So if there's more than, oh my.
If there's
I'm
more
overthinking
than one,
humans.
then it has an ampersand.
Okay.
Okay, but it gets weird when there's more than
There's
seven.
more.
If there's more than seven, then you don't put the last, that's next to the last
More than
author.
7.
The rule is 7. If it's 7, then you write down all 7 authors.
Who made that rule?
They did.
Who's
It's in the
they?
book. It's in the book. The book made the rule, okay. Whatever is in the book, that's correct. Whatever the website says, if they don't agree with the book, then the book is correct. Purdue Owl is correct because, well, they do everything right, but it's only because they do what's in the book.
So we wouldn't need that DOI, right? We could just end at the 1 through 25?
Yeah, you could just end right here. If you don't have this number, you don't always get that number. And sometimes it's a web page, so you don't have to put it in. And I don't care what database it comes from. Neither.
No.
Neither does APA. APA doesn't care where it comes from. Now, the 5th edition, you had to put in the database. You had to put it in there. So if it came from EBSCOhost, you had to put in EBSCOhost. If it came from PML, it came from PM, then you'd have to put that in there.
So how would you write it if a person has two, first and middle name, just initial, both?
Yeah, right. 2 initials, exactly. It's the hyphenated names that get a little weird. Because normally they don't put the second name in there. They just put the first initial of the first name. But you could put a hyphen in there. Is that right or wrong? Well, it doesn't say anything about it in the book, so you can do it any way you want. There you go. Okay, so this is APA citation. And sometimes when you look at the APA citation, it's incorrect. Even in an APA article, it'll be incorrect. Okay? So you will have to edit it. You need to know what it is supposed to look like. Okay? I do not count off if you get this stuff wrong. If you just give me a web page, it kind of upsets me a little bit because you didn't even try to find all that stuff. And I might take off points. But as long as you try, I'm not going to take off any points. I want you to learn this stuff. Okay. I don't want it to become painful for you. Oh my God, I lost 50 points. Okay. Anyway, so do it the best you can, and I will look at it and I will edit it. Okay. This is how they know that you know what you're talking about in graduate school. Okay, let's move on. A lot of the good information, there's a lot of good information in the abstract. It's going to answer a lot of your questions. Not all your questions, but it's going to answer a lot of your questions. This is a list of the questions. First of all, you need the title of the article. You need a brief summary of the article. Well, that's right there in the abstract, a brief summary of the article. So you can synthesize that and write it down. Don't copy the abstract, that's plagiarism. Okay. You need to be careful of plagiarism.
I have a question. So if we like copy the, the citation, when you punch in the information, right, and then it puts it together by itself, when you gather that information and then you put it on your paper,
Correct.
does that, when you run it through your plagiarism check, does that
I don't
come
do
up?
plagiarism. I don't do it. If I can't figure out if you plagiarized or not.
Well, because when I did my paper with Sue,
I know.
that
Sue
came
uses
up,
it.
and I was like, okay, but I mean,
It's a citation. It should always be the same way. So it's not plagiarism. Of course it's not plagiarism. My goodness gracious, everybody writes it exactly the same way,
okay.
including the article. But I don't run it through the plagiarism check. But I can usually, you guys write me a lot of stuff, so I'm pretty well versed on how you write. So I usually can tell when you're plagiarizing. And in some areas, in some disciplines, plagiarism is not frowned upon, like in the law. The law, you have to state the law the same way every time. So if you're talking about forensic psychology, then you're talking about somebody telling me what the law is, it's going to be, they're going to have to plagiarize. They're going to have to copy it, the way it's written. I mean, you change one word in the law and it changes the law completely. So if you're working with that type of information. So you need a brief summary of the article. It's right here in the abstract. There's a lot of good information in this abstract. I was really impressed that they put in there what statistical analysis they did. I'm asking you what the statistical analysis is, and I've explained this a couple times. It's not that I want you to understand what Pearson's chi-square is. I'm sure Sue told you what it was. Most people, unless you're a mathematician, don't have a clue what Pearson's chi-square is, but this kind of stuff scares people when they start seeing statistical information. It scares them. And they go, oh my God, I can't do a Pearson's chi-square for love nor money. If they say that to themselves, then of course they're afraid of it. Now all of a sudden they're afraid of all these statistical tests that they don't really understand. I mean, who does understand what a multinomial logistic regression is? Well, there's like 3 people in the United States that understand what it is, and none of them have read this article, so, okay. But it's the statistical analysis that they use. A statistician knows what it means.
Statistician.
1% of people who have a PhD in psychology knows what it means.
Do you
And
know
most,
what it means?
I have no clue. I do know what regression analysis. I know what a regression analysis is, and I can figure it out. Multinomial means, many words is what it means, or many numbers. And logistics has to do with how you set things up. So, yeah, you can kind of figure it out, but it doesn't tell you how to do it. And of course, in this case, we're talking about words. We're not talking about numbers. Multinomial, and they assign percentages. They assign coding to all of these different words. So they had to use multinomial logistic regression in order to do it. I just want you to start becoming comfortable with some of the terms that they use in statistics. How many have had statistics? How painful was it? Pretty painful? Hurt a lot?
Yes.
You didn't bleed from the eyes? Your ears didn't start, leaking things? Are you?
I actually enjoyed statistics,
Oh, there you go. Well, maybe you should become a mathematician. My son's a mathematician.
and I wanted to take another course in
There you go.
statistics.
Okay, well, good luck with that. I hope it works. Maybe you can learn what a multinomial logistic regression is and tell us all. Come back and tell us all. So this information is in there. That's a question that you have to answer.
Are you going to send us this PowerPoint?
This PowerPoint, if I can put it up, I can put it on the website. So, okay, so there's a lot of good information. Ownership Using both Pearson's chi-square test and multinomial logistic regression, we assess how ownership, state political ideology, geographic location, and news format affect what ideas are included in the debate over whether Terry Schiavo's hydration and nutrition tubes should be removed, as well as the tone with which these ideas are discussed. We're about to get the research question. We find that mainstream newspapers are relatively inclusive of diverse ideas and perspectives, regardless of whether the newspaper is independently or corporately owned, the political leanings of the target audience, and the geographic location of the outlet. Local newspapers do significantly differ from one another in terms of the frequency and tone with which they include diverse viewpoints. Our research suggests that local outlets downplay ideas that are likely to be regarded as controversial by their target audiences. And this is what they were looking for. They were trying to determine if we go all over the United States, everybody that's writing news articles about Terry Schiavo, what were their leanings? Were they partisan? Were they partisan? Were they, was it different in different parts of the country? Yes, ma'am.
So with the abstract, where is the methodology when you can point it out?
Oh, it's not there.
It's not there?
Not-
So it's not in the abstract?
No, you're gonna have to look through the rest of the article to find that.
No.
Yes, you are. Well, sometimes it's in there.
Sometimes it's written in the abstract, right?
I'm sorry?
Sometimes it's written.
Oh, yeah, sometimes it's in the abstract. Sometimes the entire article is right there in the abstract, but usually it's not. So you'll have to go through the article. And not only that, but you'll want to look at the article to determine if what the abstract is correct. A lot of times the abstract is increases the accuracy of the, or at least they say that they are more accurate than they actually are. And one of the questions that we all have to ask ourselves is, were there enough samples? Did they take enough samples? If there were only 20 people that they tested, is that representative of everybody in the United States? No, probably not. In this case, of course, they were looking at newspapers, and they were looking at newspaper articles. Oh, good. So they've got all these articles, they've got all these editorials, and there's a difference between editorials and articles. Articles are supposed to give you information. Editorials are just the thoughts of the guy that wrote the editorial. It's an opinion piece, exactly. Okay. It's like the difference between watching Fox News and Fox News. If you're watching, who's on now? They just kicked Tucker Carlson off. I guess he's still on there. He's the one that said that white supremacy was a hoax. And since he said that, he's been off the air. So.
Oh, boy.
White supremacy. All right. Good old Tucker Carlson. So when we go to page 9, we see the hypothesis. The hypothesis is, there's like 3 paragraphs, and it's really hard to pick out the research question as far as this article is concerned. Sometimes it's written in the abstract. It says right there, the research question that we were trying to determine was, it's in the abstract, but in this case it's not. And it's kind of hard to pick out. I mean, it was kind of in the abstract, we saw it in there, but this is what the hypothesis is. Analyzing media coverage of the Terry Schiavo case, the researchers determined inclusiveness of local coverage in general audience newspapers using ownership, state political ideology, geographic location, and news format as their criteria. And I synthesized that from page 9, looking at page 9. It wasn't easy to find. It took me about 15 minutes to figure out what the research question was. The researchers determined that media used 42 specific arguments that fit within 6 general frames of reference. So they had to decide what the criteria that they were going to use to look at their articles. One of the arguments that they looked at was the legal aspect of it. Can they legally pull the plug? Can the parents take possession of their daughter? Who's in charge of the life and death of this child, was the question. So there's a legal aspect to it. They looked at the medical aspect to it. Is she brain dead? What's going to happen if they just leave the feeding tube in there and they keep hydrating her and keep feeding her? The medical question. There was a political question, huge political question. Because even though nobody was mentioning Roe v. Wade was on everybody's mind. So there was a political question. The governor of the state of Florida was the brother of the president of the United States. And they seemed to be in lockstep with one another. And the governor of Florida was able to get the president of the United States to talk about a case, a legal case in Florida. And then, of course, he got the Congress involved. And of course, because Congress got involved, the Supreme Court had to decide whether they could actually get involved. And they decided they couldn't. So there was a huge political question. There was there was a question about disability, because Terri Schiavo is disabled. She has brain damage. So the question was, so there were different organizations who support people with disabilities, and where did they come out in the argument? So that was another question. And of course, we had editorials being written by different organizations that support people with disabilities. Of course, the two main questions were right to life and death with dignity. That was actually the main question. Does she have a right to life despite the fact that she has a flatline brain scan, or what? Or should they give her death with dignity? That was the question.
So since then, have they made like new rules about like how severe it is? Because I know there's like, really? Because I thought there's like classes or something about how much someone.
There are various states where you can choose to die. Suicide's against the law everywhere. However, it's against the law, yeah. Yeah, if you try to commit suicide, they won't arrest you. What they'll do is they'll put you in a mental institution, or they will put you on suicide watch. It's against the law. You're not supposed to kill yourself. You don't have a right to kill yourself.
Oh,
You
wow.
belong to the state.
Yeah.
Okay. So it's like murdering. It's like murdering somebody. It's against the law. But not in every state. There are two states where you have the right to death with dignity. One is Oregon and the other is Massachusetts. We just passed that law in the last election. That's interesting. That's what it is. Okay. So they looked at 42 different arguments and they came up with 6 different general frameworks. And it had to do with legal, medical, political, disability, right to life, and death with dignity. We're talking about how they put the research together. The study was qualitative because they were coding the articles. In other words, they were finding words that meant that had to do with the legal aspect, or they were coding words that had to do with the medical aspect of the argument. And they coded all the 6 general frames, and this is what they were looking for. They were looking for words that dealt with either death with dignity, right to life, disability, the legal aspect, the medical aspect, and the political aspect. So there were 6 general frameworks. They tried to determine whether it was partisan or neutral. In other words, was it balanced politically? Was it balanced as far as the legal aspect was concerned? Or was it partisan? I mean, if you watch Fox News, usually you get a partisan idea of politics. They tend to be relatively conservative, usually. So anytime they're not conservative, then it hits the national news. And of course, Trump is mad at them right now because they're not supporting some of the things he's doing. They coded whether the tone was supportive or oppositional. Supportive of the husband in this case. And all this is on page 9 and 10, as curious as that is. Okay. And of course, so where do you find any of this stuff? Well, in the case of this article, it tells you where all this stuff is. This article's 30 pages long, but you don't have to read all 30 pages. You don't have to read the whole first part. The first part just tells you why they came up, why they came up with this argument, why they wanted to write an article about it. You can go right to the data and methods, and that will tell you how they did the research. It's right there on page 6. Yeah, it starts on page 6, but they give you the dependent variables. They talk about the independent variables. Oh, I'm sorry. I apologize. I'm sorry. I didn't realize you were late. Oh no, I'm just kidding. Does anybody else need one? Does anybody else really forget anybody else? Okay. Sorry about that. All right. So all of this stuff is in here, and you can find it. You don't have to read the whole thing. Interestingly, you don't have to read the discussion and the conclusion at the end. They should give you all that information in the findings. If you read the findings, then you don't have to read the end of the paper, as strange as that may seem. You can read the whole thing if you want. First part's kind of boring because they're telling you why they wrote the paper. I don't know if you need to know that information or not. It gives you some background information. It tells you the story of Terry Schiavo, but I already knew the story of Terry Schiavo. I didn't need to read it. Okay. This was really important to me because I'd worked in medicine and I'd watched people suffer for a really long time, and I was very much in favor of just pulling the damn plug on poor old Terry and letting her go. It made sense to me. I mean, if there's no lucidity there, go ahead and pull the plug. So I really followed this one fairly closely. And it upset me when the president decided he was going to back his brother. I'm not a Republican, so, or a George Bush fan. Anyway, okay. George W. Bush. Let's not get the two of them mixed up. Okay, so it's a qualitative study. They quantified the quality. So they gave, all they did was count up the number of coded words that they had. But they had to code the words. Okay, so that made it a qualitative study because they were just looking at words. They weren't looking at numbers. They weren't looking at survey results. They were coding the articles, and they were trying to determine whether they were partisan, whether they were neutral, or whether it wasn't in there at all, whether the information wasn't in there at all. The independent variables, they determined whether the media was independently or corporately owned. This is important to them. So if we're talking about U.S. News and World Report, it's corporately owned. If we're talking about the New York Times, it's corporately owned. If we're talking about the Los Angeles Times, it's corporately owned. If it's independently owned, it would be like the Gallup Independent is independently owned. It's not owned by a conglomerate of newspapers across the Southwest. It is published in Gallup, and it's owned by a guy in Albuquerque.
So what would be an example of like the other part? Would that be like
Somebody independent or corporate?
corporate, like New York Times?
Like New York Times is owned by a corporation. U.S. News and World Report is owned by a corporation. Curiously, CNN is owned by a corporation right now, but Fox News is owned by an individual. It's owned by Rupert Murdoch, who's not even from the United States. He's Australian. He lives in England.
Wasn't there like a newspaper that was distributed based on what majority of the people in that community believed in or something? And like parts of the article was,
Are we talking about Terry Schiavo, or are we talking about what?
I don't remember what just in general regarding newspaper stuff.
Yeah, usually it agrees with the people in the neighborhood, in the community, otherwise they wouldn't read the newspaper. So when they write an article, they write it for the people, agreeing with the people in the community, otherwise they won't buy the newspaper. This has been a problem with the Navajo Times from time to time. They have had editorials that piss people off, so they stop reading the newspaper. This kind of stuff happens all the time. I'm from Muncie, Indiana, and Muncie has the Muncie Star. Yeah, it's the Muncie Star. It's owned by a corporation. I don't know if you remember Dan Quayle. Dan Quayle was the vice president under George H.W. Bush. But his family owns all the newspapers. It owns a string of newspapers all through Indiana. They're very, very wealthy. But they're also very, very relatively conservative. So the Muncie Star, the Indianapolis Star are all connected. It's a corporation. It's a family corporation. And they're very conservative. So when they give you the news, they give it to you from a perspective of a conservative perspective rather than a liberal perspective or whatever. They hate unions, so they never say anything nice about unions. So every time I go home, I read the Muncie Star, and I get so upset because these people are so partisan. I mean, I'm getting news from all over the United States. I don't even read local news anymore because I've moved so many times it doesn't make any difference. Local news is kind of silly news, saying this is important and that's important, but it's not. What's important is national news. Whether we're going to have a nuclear war, that's important. Whether we're being attacked by terrorists, that's important. Anyway, okay, so the independent variables, they tried to determine if they were independent or corporately owned. Sometimes it's difficult to tell, but they were looked at 137, I think, 137 different newspapers. They determined political ideology to see if the media tailored their content to fit local sensitivities. They labeled them either conservative, moderate, or liberal. Now, I'm liberal, so if I look at something, if I look at a newspaper article, I'm going to see it from a liberal bent, and I will look at that article and I'll say that's conservative. But if somebody were conservative and they read the same article, they may see it as liberal because their bent is completely the other direction. So this was a problem. This was a problem, deciding whether it was conservative, moderate, or liberal. It was a value judgment on their part. This is one of the reasons why that this is qualitative rather than quantitative. I mean, how many points do you have to add up to be liberal or to be conservative or to be moderate? It's a value judgment. And so that's one of the ways that they coded newspapers. Geographic region was determined. There were 4 regions that they talked about. They talked about the West, the Midwest, the Northeast, and the South. Now this gets really interesting because what if you're on the border of South and Northeast? What if you live in Virginia? Are you South or are you Northeast? What if you live in St. Louis? Is St. Louis in the West or is it in the Midwest? Or Denver, is Denver a western city or is it a Midwestern city? I know. Is it on state lines or no? If you have Kentucky is a relatively conservative state and they consider themselves part of the South, but if you're in Louisville, Indiana's right across the border, so is that Midwest or is that South? So they had to make these determinations. Okay. News format had to do with whether the article was a news story or an editorial. This is on page 9. This became quite controversial because sometimes the news stories were editorials, but they were written on the front page, not on the editorial page. Usually it's easy to tell if something's an editorial because it's on the editorial page. It's on the second page or third page, or however that newspaper happens to do it. So they had to determine whether it was an editorial or whether it was an article. To sample 139 different newspapers around the United States, this is on page 10. These were the newspapers following the Shiloh case. That's a lot of newspapers if you think about it. A lot of newspapers will print articles, but they are just AP articles, or they're UPS articles. They're not, they don't write them themselves. If they don't write them themselves, if it's just they're getting articles from a stringer, then it's, you know, it's a national article, so it doesn't count. But there were 139 newspapers around the United States that were writing articles about the Shiloh case. They either had editorials or they had articles written by their own reporters dealing with the Shiloh case. As far as bias is concerned, these were the newspapers covering the story, so it was a census sample. In other words, they looked at all the newspapers coming out in the United States, and they found 139 that actually were talking about the Terry Shiloh case. So it was a census. It was all the newspapers in the United States writing their own articles. We're talking about, what question are we answering here? Oh, the sample, okay. Statistical test they use, it was right there in the abstract. So they used Pearson's chi-square test and multinomial logistic regression. That was in the abstract. Usually there's a whole section about statistics. If you read an article, you read a research article, all you need to do is pick out the statistical test. It's going to give you all kinds of numbers and stuff. Only Ms. Wallace cares about these things. She's the only one that understands about how to add and subtract or multiply.
So is that a method?
Yeah, no, that's the statistical.
I mean, would that be under methods?
No, it's under statistics.
I mean, and like, that's a method that was used to,
It's not going to be under the method.
it's not,
No, it's going to be between the method and the findings. There's going to be a section in there. This article doesn't have, I don't think it does, maybe it does. I'll look at my own paper. I've got these things all over the room. Where does it talk about the statistics? Page 16. Oh, they're talking about the tables. Wasn't there a section? Yeah, page 13. It's in the findings in this paper, in this article. What's the difference between this article and one that you read from a journal from a psychology journal? What's the difference? This is actually a journalist journal. Okay, yeah. So in a psychology journal, they put everything in the same order. It's always in the same order. Statistics will be between the method and the findings, usually. But this one doesn't have that. This article doesn't. Okay. The findings, independently owned media presented a more lively and critical perspective. That was the findings. Conservative media presented a more partisan picture when presenting a medical framework writing to the target population. And we get this information out of the tables. There's tables at the end of the article, and we can see all this. Regionally, there were more stories and articles offered by newspapers in the South region and around Florida, which is logical. I mean, it was right there. Oh. Remember the guy that murdered his daughter? Okay. They charged him with not only first-degree murder, but also with rape and statutory rape and kidnapping. So evidently she was sexually assaulted before she was murdered.
Where was your mother?
She had gone to visit the father. The father and the mother were estranged. They weren't together. And she went to visit the father in the father's home.
Oh.
And according to, I'm guessing what's going to come out, because they charged him with statutory rape. I'm guessing they're going to, this has been going on for a while. He's been sexually molesting this child over time. I'm guessing. Well, we'll see what happens in the case.
So was he under the influence of anything?
That information, I haven't seen that information. It's mostly just the same story over and over and over again. But yesterday, they charged him with rape and having sex with a minor, statutory rape. So evidently he molested the child. And the child wasn't killed, he didn't strangle her to death, she died when he slit her throat. They determined that. Okay. That's interesting, isn't it? Okay, so conservative media presented a more partisan picture. It was a regional story that was more important outside or inside the region, the southern region. There were 5 times more stories about Terry Schiavo written in the southern region as were written in the west. Wasn't a big issue out here in New Mexico and Arizona, Colorado, Utah, Nevada, California, not such a big issue out here. Editorials were far more partisan than news stories and were less likely to include legal, medical, political, and disability topics. It was mostly right to life or death with dignity. So the editorials were far more partisan. The statistically significant results, page 15 and 16. Significant results were seen when looking at the geographic locations and different dependent variables. Looking at legal arguments, all the regions were most likely to take a neutral tone. As far as the legal arguments were concerned, since everybody was getting involved in this, including Congress. When using medical arguments, all regions were most likely to take a neutral tone. These are reporters. They're not doctors. They're not EMTs. They're not nurses. They're reporters, and they really don't understand the medical aspect of this. So you would expect them not to understand the medical terminology and the medical argument. Political arguments were most likely to either be not mentioned or dealt with in a neutral tone in all regions. So they didn't talk about Roe v. Wade. They didn't talk about the fact that this would become a legal precedent. And it was a political football that they were using. Looking at dealing with Schiavo as a person with a disability was rarely used in any region, but sometimes it was mentioned in editorials. The right to life argument was rarely used in any region. Right to life. The argument that was the most widely used in all regions was death with dignity. Okay. The conclusion reflects the actual findings, and of course they were dealing with newspapers and how newspapers wrote up the story. So most newspapers were neutral, and so they kind of presented the case in a neutral manner, which is how most people took it. I mean, if you were watching the national news or reading a national newspaper, then you're probably getting the story from that point of view. And that's it, I think, isn't it? Yes, that's it. I'll put this up on the website. Okay? That's how you do an article critique. Yeah, do you have to read the whole article? No, you don't have to read the whole article, but you have to you need to answer all the questions. You need to find the answer to all the questions. That's all you need to do. It may take you 15 minutes to do one, it may take you 3 hours because you have to read it. And you have to go back and read it again. And you have to go back and read it again. Okay. That's how you do an article. And like I said, most of the information that you need will be in the abstract, but not all the information. And one of the things you're going to have to do is you're going to have to look at the findings and determine whether the abstract presents the findings correctly, because sometimes they don't. A lot of times with articles like this one where you have 3 different authors, they will split the thing up. Usually they've got somebody doing the statistics, and so they'll write the statistical portion. You'll have somebody else writing the abstract and the beginning portion, and then the other person will be writing up the rest of the article. So you're not getting the same author for all the parts of the article. But normally they will read it through and determine if it's accurate or not. So a lot of times the findings are completely different from the abstract because it has 2 different authors.
So when you're doing an in-text citation, And this is probably something I should have learned my freshman year, but do we do all the last names and then the year?
Yes.
You can't just do the year.
What if it's like a big old medical team that did this?
Then you write the first 6 out. You put dot, 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 and then the last off. You leave out everybody from 5 to the last off. You leave everybody else out. They're dot, dot, dot.
Okay, that makes sense.
I know. Lots of strange rules. And that's one of them. Now, in the 5th edition, you put an ampersand. But in the 6th edition, you don't. Okay. Yeah, okay. So, but what happens if you have 7 authors? How many of them do you write down? You write down all 7.
And with the end.
With the ampersand. Yeah, because who are you going to leave out?
That's just like
So you write 6. And then you put dot, dot, dot if there's 8, or 9, or 10, or 12, or 15, or 45. But if there's 7, you write all 7. I know. Strange rules. If you get it wrong, I'll correct it. Don't worry about it. And I've read the book. Oh, God, I hate that book.
What is the name of the book?
I don't know. Methodology and APA methodology.
There's one that Dr. Robinson makes you get in her English class. It's the little DK handbook. It tells you step by step everything.
It's MLA.
Is it MLA? No, they have APA format in there too. They have,
She's teaching you APA format?
yeah,
Okay, that's good.
it has everything in there, that little book.
Let's use that one. Yes, ma'am. You have your arm out.
I'm
No?
stretching.
Okay, stretch. Okay. Okay, so, oh, they're holding that guy without bail, so don't worry about him escaping. Burgess is the man. Joshua Burgess is his name. Okay. Do we have time? Yeah, sure, why not? The clock is correct. Now I remember where I was. Okay. Look this up before class. There we are, I'm right here. Okay. So what are we talking about today? We're talking about psychologists as scientists. The basic psychological research can be conducted to assist the courts and law enforcement. Research on visual perception can help us understand the accuracy of eyewitness testimony. Research on memory can help people understand repression and long-term forgetting of a traumatic event. Research of social attitudes and behavior can clarify why people obey or don't obey the law, as well as who is likely to become a terrorist. And of course, all of this information is very important. Who would you rather have making these decisions? A judge who has no idea about psychology, or a psychologist? And the answer is, we need psychologists to give the judges this information, and the lawyers. I've watched lawyers questioning people, and of course I have a background in medicine, I have a background in psychology, and I'm thinking, you don't have any idea what you're saying, because they're asking them medical questions, and they're asking them questions like, well, if you have a high glucose level, does that make you diabetic? You know, that kind of stupid stuff, ignorant stuff like that. If he were a medical person, he would understand that just because you have a high glucose doesn't have anything to do with diabetes. People with diabetes do have high glucoses, but it's chronic high glucose levels. And of course, he's trying to define diabetes as just a high glucose level, and he's not really saying it correctly. Okay. I was just using that as an example. So we need these experts, and we need psychologists who will testify in court. That's important. Otherwise, the court is ignorant. The court is doing things that don't fit. We know that eyewitness testimony is not always accurate. We know that that's true. We know that two people seeing the same thing will see different things. because they're focusing on something different. We know that if a weapon is involved, then the weapon becomes the focus of people's attention, and they're not looking at anything else. So if somebody has a gun and somebody over here is beating somebody else up, but this guy's got a gun, we're gonna focus on the gun and miss that whole scene. If we have an individual that has never been around weapons before, then their focus is really going to be on that gun, and they're not gonna see anything else. However, if we're dealing with a military person who's around guns all the time, they're not going to focus as much on the gun. I mean, this all has to do with eyewitness testimony, and we know that it's extremely inaccurate because everybody has their own focus. Everybody has their own way of looking at things, and everybody has their own perspective. Somebody on that side of the room is going to see what's happening here differently from somebody on this side of the room. It's just the way it works. And that's one of the reasons why the police have to interview everyone that was involved in an incident, because they want to see it from a lot of different perspectives. If they're smart enough to do that, not all police are smart enough.
That was going to be the question I was going to ask. How do these police officers know what kind of questions to ask?
Well, that's an excellent question. They are trained to ask specific types of questions, and this is one of the reasons why if you get two different policemen, they'll ask the same questions. So there are types of questions that they have to ask. There are informational questions that they're looking for. One of the questions they have to ask is, did you have anything to do with the perpetrator or the victim? Individuals that are related to the victim or they're friends with the victim, they're going to see things differently than if they're friends of the perpetrator, they're friends of the other guy. And this is one of the questions that they have to ask. So yeah, they have a set of questions that they are trained to ask. Of course, if they're a newbie, if they haven't done this very much, it doesn't seem very automatic. Because it's not automatic, it's more in a monotone. They're not getting the same answer. What they want is conversation between the two people. But if they ask questions where you can answer yes or no, that's not a conversation. That's me trying to get an answer from you and you answering the way you think I want you to answer. So they're not really trained in it.
Are there certain questions that a police officer can and cannot ask?
Cannot ask?
Or is that really just not relevant in, say, a case that's criminal or?
But it really, I see what you're talking about. You're talking about, can he ask you?
I mean, what is appropriate, I guess is what.
Right, yeah, can he ask you, did you have sex with the victim, today? They're not supposed to ask that question unless it's relevant, unless that has something, and if the guy's naked, then that's a relevant question. But otherwise, it's not appropriate. Why? That's none of his business. So that's an interesting point. So they're always walking that tightrope between appropriateness and inappropriateness, that kind of thing. As strange as that may seem. Ethics of basic scientists. Basic scientists, like all psychologists, must adhere to standards of ethical conduct. They cannot fabricate or forge data. And of course, that's what was happening here. A lot of times, one of the things that we see in research articles, and I hate to say this because they are psychologists that are doing this crap, a lot of times what we see is they have a bias. They want the information to come out a certain way. But they're not supposed to change the results. Once upon a time, there was a sociologist by the name of Kinsey, and Kinsey was looking at human sexuality in the United States. That was what his topic was. This is back in the 40s, right after World War II. And he interviewed a lot of people. He interviewed a lot of people around the United States. He was interviewing people that other individuals tried to pretend didn't exist, like homosexuals. This is right after World War II. And of course, that was a taboo subject all over the United States, but theoretically, he was talking to these individuals. It turns out that he fabricated some of his interviews. He lied about them. He didn't interview as many people as he said he interviewed. He was bisexual himself, and because of that, he increased the number of gay people that he was talking to, or he fabricated the number of gay people that he talked about, and he made it look more normal that there were so many gay people in the United States. He was claiming that there were a lot of bisexual people in the United States. Of course, he was bisexual himself, so that was the lifestyle that he was leading, and he saw that as normal, and because he saw that as normal, he said that this was very common in the United States, and actually it wasn't. So you can fabricate these things. There are people that lie. There are researchers that want to publish this article. And in order to get that article published, they interviewed 35 people, and they claim that they interviewed 350 people. Now, how do we know that they did or they didn't? We don't. They're scientists. They're supposed to be ethical. Okay. And of course, nobody's supposed to plagiarize. A lot of people are getting in trouble with plagiarism these days. Joe Biden, who's running for president, at one point they proved that he had plagiarized something, an article that he wrote or a book. There's a part of this book that was plagiarized. So plagiarism is something you're not supposed to do. They present a skewed selection of data to hide observations that do not fit their conclusions. So they throw out data, and you can throw out data if you are doing research. You can throw out data if it's too extreme. You can throw it out as outliers, what they refer to as outliers. So what do you throw out? The stuff you don't like? Is that the way it works? No, you're supposed to include all of that. And statistically, you have to tell everybody that this was one of my answers, but I saw it as an outlier, so I discarded it. That's what you're supposed to do. It's what you're supposed to put it in your article, that it's an outlier. This is one of the results that we had. A lot of times they just leave it out, and they don't say anything about it. The biggest problem we have in research is that people do not publish research that doesn't work. There's no negative research out there. It's only positive. I'm brilliant, and I thought this was going to happen. And when it didn't happen, I just didn't finish my research. And they don't publish that. But they need to. We need negative research. We need to know that this idea didn't fit. Because if you don't know that it didn't fit, then the next guy's going to come along and think that he should do research.
One research I thought about that could be really interesting is to do research on the cafeteria and the food here.
Okay.
I mean, it's probably not significant, but
I don't know. Maybe.
Oh, at the cafeteria,
Yes.
I did that.
Really?
You should do it, because I'm kind of curious about what you learned. Because what I found was totally off of what I thought I was going to find. It's kind of scary too.
What did you find?
Stalkers, people who follow people. The 3 people I interviewed are like, it gets kind of scary. They kind of wish, and then they're talking about more security, and I'm like, I wasn't going for that, but okay, and that's what I
There's
put my paper.
stalkers in the cafeteria?
Yeah, that's just one of the major things.
I think I know what she means, just how, once you start, I guess, doing and checking into certain issues or problems,
Okay.
then you have people that are
I'll start
looking out for
following you
you,
around.
and then you're labeled all the troublemaker.
So you're a troublemaker?
I didn't like.
The instigator.
I can't tell anybody because.
Just take the flower out of your hair, they won't know who you are. Just an idea. It's fairly obvious who you are because you always live with. All right. So they started stalking you.
Yeah, they said that, like, they noticed that guys always go in at the same time they do, and they sit directly across from them. So she would try and move, and here that person would move with her. So
There's this study that was done in New York City, just this guy who would take pictures every single day at the same time. And the exact same people came by every time.
Huh.
So-
Well,
And
they
it's
were
a
going
small
home, yeah, I
campus,
guess,
so-
logically.
It is interesting though, because with Dr. Ami's ethnographic methods course, you have to do a study on culture on campus.
Oh, okay.
So you
And that
notice
was your
all of
study on
these
culture.
different things, so it's interesting.
How about the food?
Everybody hates the food, that's how
I
you
know.
do research.
We don't need research for
The
that.
food's not good.
So you hate the food now? Did you hate the food before with the other food service?
Uncooked chicken one time, somebody could have died, there was blood in the plate.
Wow. I love
Can we do
blood.
research on that?
Yeah.
One of my favorite
Get better
flavors.
food?
Get better food.
Well, the
Great.
students are the customer, you know, they deserve a lot better.
Well, sure, I mean, you're paying for the food, you might as well get good food.
Do you eat the food here?
Hell no. Oh my God, no.
I feel like dying today.
Yeah. But I try not to go by the the cafeteria because a lot of times they cook mutton and I can't stand the smell of mutton, so
Shots like
I
that.
try to stay away. Yeah, well, of course.
Or spam, I was like, I have to rethink this.
We experience the same thing, so of course he doesn't like mutton. They must treat human subjects in an ethical manner, of course, they must reveal any conflict of interest, and it is time to stop. Why don't we stop right here? And I will finish chapter